Welcome to the Breaking Brad podcast. I'm Brad Burnam, founder of Turn Therapeutics, and there are so many health shows out there, podcasts, specials on TV about, the next miracle cure, that thing across the ocean that we can't get. And I have yet to find a show that tells you why. I think I may be the only person, or at least the only person I can find, that has gone from being desperate, sick, 5 years, dozens of surgeries, thousands of stitches, hundreds of doctor's appointments, that found a miracle for myself across an ocean, brought it here, reformulated it, taught myself the manufacturing process, the labeling process, the regulatory system, found the investors, jumped on a plane, flew 500,000 miles over a couple of years with nothing but an iPhone and a credit card, and actually got those products to market. And I built it into a company. So this show is about that system, this exclusionary process that keeps innovations from reaching you, from reaching patients. We're going to talk to the innovators. We're going to talk to the rebel scientists. We're going to talk to people and try to make sure those miracles don't die because they can't get those products and those miracles through the system. So that's why this show is called Breaking Brad Cures Unfiltered. My story, reminds me a lot of that line that Joe Walsh said in the Eagles documentary, where your life feels like a bunch of, chaotic random events crashing into each other, that when you look back on them feel a little bit like a novel. I'd call it an unfortunate event followed by a series of unlikely events that, I'm really proud of the way they turned out in the end. I was a medical device rep for about a decade, working in hospitals, operating rooms, interacting with patients, touching all the surfaces that they don't teach you not to touch when you're not a full-blown doctor. And I loved that job. I loved working with patients. I loved being in the hospital. I loved seeing people get better. I loved wearing the scrubs. I loved feeling like I was a part of the cure, for those patients. I have very specific memories of even just making changes on pacemakers and people being able to just walk better afterward, have more energy. And it was so unbelievably fulfilling. The wrong place at the wrong time put me on a completely different path. I went to bed one night like nothing was different. Brushed my teeth, got in bed, woke up the next morning, went back to that same mirror that you stand in front of every night, and half my head was purple and black, swollen to twice its normal size. Terrifying. I felt behind my ear, back here, sort of in my scalp, and there was I guess I could call it chestnut size if I was going to go with something just to give a reference point, like an abscess back there, and it was black when I pulled my ear forward. It had obviously spread. My ear was the same color. So super fortunate that my dad's a physician. He didn't live far away. He met me at the local hospital, Tarzana Hospital. Called his infectious disease friend who actually met me in the hallway outside the ER. I didn't even have to go in and get into a bed before they were saying you need emergency surgery. This is a really bad infection. And that's sometimes where my story, and when it gets romanticized, people forget scary moments like that because those are terrifying when you see looks on the faces like that doctor had. That afternoon I was in a surgery center. They didn't even have time to call an anesthesiologist. It was 4 hours of lying on a table, cutting, burning, sawing. And when things are that close to your eardrum, you hear everything. It's hard to actually think back on some of those memories because they were unbelievably traumatic. But I got through it. I got through that first surgery. I got through that 4-hour surgery, those 50 stitches, those chunks of my face and ear being removed. I got put on those first massive cocktails of antibiotics, and 6 days later, I was back in an operating room because the infection was that aggressive. It was a really horrible bacteria called CRE. The medical professionals out there, know that's not a good one to get. It's got about a 70% fatality rate when it gets in your bloodstream. Did some damage to my system. I still have to take hormone therapy till this day, but I'm alive. I consider myself one of the lucky ones. I kept having to go back for surgery after surgery after surgery, no matter how many courses of antibiotics I was taking for 5 years. The volumes of my surgical chart that are 3 folders thick. It was 6 days a week. My job was going to the doctor to get these wounds packed and repacked, cultured and recultured, new abscesses drained. I wasn't living, I was existing. I was sitting on the couch all day, popping antibiotics and probiotics like Tic Tacs. And needless to say, it really took a toll on my mental health, not just my physical health. And at some point, desperation takes over. You start thinking, why is this happening to me? Not in a pity party sense, or maybe in a pity party sense, but you definitely want to know, like, why are the tools that our doctors have, and these are amazing doctors, we're talking some of the best in the world, doing everything they could. What is it they don't have that is keeping these things from stopping? And I remember from when I was a medical device rep, I used to hear all the time that Europe had things a few generations before us. So I got on Google, started looking around. What are they doing for recurrent infections in Europe? What are they doing in other places in the world when you've got these recurring infections that just won't go away? And I learned about things like biofilm, which is the DNA remnants that the bacteria leave behind that the surgeons can't necessarily get and the pills can't reach. I learned about ways that they were cutting at that biofilm and preventing it from regrowing new infections and spreading to new places. And I actually found a chemical in Europe. Believe it or not, it was a 2010 document. I'll never forget it. It was this green and white document. It feels like this symbolic call to action that I'll always, remember as a big moment. It was a paper written by about 230 authors, the UK Wound Care Society, calling this ingredient, that had been around for decades, basically, the wonder bread for wounds, that they treat it like saline or, hydrogen peroxide like we might use. But at the same time, it doesn't cause damage. It doesn't cause, toxicity to the area. And nobody was using it here. I can tell you that I've sat at the table of major health agencies and discussed with chiefs of divisions inside the United States, told them about this ingredient, and they'd never heard of it. And I remember just being blown away that the Atlantic Ocean can be so big of a barrier, for sharing knowledge, not just sharing products. So I wanted this ingredient. I wanted to figure out a way that I could get a hold of it and I could put it to use so that I could stop just existing in this constant state of surgery to surgery to surgery. I went on Alibaba.com or one of those chemical websites at the time. I don't know, I probably broke a customs law or something in the process. And this chemical showed up at my garage in Van Nuys. And it's like, well, shit, that's cool. Now I need some petrolatum, which is not just an uppity way to say petroleum, by the way. It's actually the refined and, they remove the waxes and the oils and it makes it less flammable and more pure. I did get corrected about that in the beginning when I started talking about those ingredients. And I ordered a 55-gallon drum of petrolatum from a U.S. distributor, and it showed up at my house too. And I've got this big green barrel of, petrolatum in my garage too. It's like, well, I guess I need something to mix them with, because I'm going to try and basically frappe these things into something we can use in my own ear, in these abscesses. So I got a $69 mortar mixer on Amazon, this orange monster that I swear to this day was my favorite mixer I ever used. I love that damn thing. And then I was like, well, I got to heat up the petrolatum, because you got to mix this stuff together. So I went to Home Depot and I bought those pipe warmers, those things that you wrap your pipes with in the Midwest, when it gets cold at night so the pipes don't freeze over. I'm literally working in a garage, wrapping barrels of petrolatum with pipe warmers. They look, those orange plug things just going around it. And then I got pots and pans from Bed Bath & Beyond. I probably used one of the 20% off coupons, but I got like 20 of them. Those big ass soup ones that your mom uses at the holidays. My mom makes matzo ball soup in them. And I was heating up the petrolatum overnight. I was going down there in the morning using a garden shovel. I kid you not. It was the easiest way to just get chunks of this goo out of the green drum and putting big dollops of it, that were this big into these steel pots, putting them on a freaking hot plate and heating it all up and basically just trying to like NutriBullet these things into something that might work. And I kept finding out that my elementary school teachers were right and all the songs were right, that oil and water are really hard to mix. I have no doubt that my neighbors were probably thinking I was making something else in that garage. But I was actually just trying to make something to end my misery, end my endless recurrent surgeries. But that was a wild experience, and you think back on things at the time and they're funny. Like I can't believe, how crazy it sounds in retrospect that I built this makeshift manufacturing facility in my garage, but that's just part of the story, and it makes it fun. And I've still got a green drill, that I was making in, the kitchen experiments, with a smaller bit. So I could just try smaller versions of it before I went down in the garage to make the bigger versions of it. It was like I was scaling up, you would do in a big factory, but like, well, shit, first we should try it in a small bowl before we put it in the big pot that, you make the soup in. That's what we call DIY science or, kitchen science. But you know what? It worked. And I love that part of the story. And I can't imagine how many hundreds of millions of dollars another company might have spent doing that. Something did click finally. And I remember it actually clicking when I was reading an article that was 180 degrees ass backwards on the subject, to be honest. And it's a complicated multi-step process that has to do with cooling rates and heating rates and volume. And it almost actually looked a bit like a geometry problem where I was doing like the slopes. But I was doing, well, this heats this fast and this heats this fast and cools that fast. And I kind of figured out where they'd hit at the bottom. And I did it and it worked. And then it worked again and it worked again. And then I threw an ingredient in there. I actually remember using the active ingredient of Bactine. It's called benzalkonium chloride, which in large quantities can actually burn you. And Bactine, it's like 0.13%. So that's the non-burn level, maybe just a little bit of a sting. I hadn't quite figured out at that moment on a really deep chemical level that I had suspended ingredients in there rather than mixing them. So I was using enough to fill up this whole formula, with 0.13%. But the liquid part of it that I was fusing in was actually carrying a lot more, and I got a 3rd-degree burn. But, sometimes you got to be your own guinea pig to get products out there. So that was a big learning moment for me. After I figured that out, I made a recipe using that ingredient, that I found in Europe. And then I thought, okay, what do I do with this now? And this is where I started seeing barriers, where people they feel like, okay, I've got a great idea. I've got a product that might work on something, How do I figure out if it works? How do I get it to people? So the first barrier was, does it work? So I found a lab actually in Texas called Microchem that I still work with to this day. And I'm happy to actually mention on the air because I love those guys. And they said, yeah, you can send us stuff and we'll test it. You don't have to go through 8 different consultants and lawyers just to get a product tested. You can just send it to us. I was like, well, that's cool. Like $400 or $500. I sent it. Does it work on this bug that is plaguing my life? And it turned out it did. I was like, cool, let's try some other bugs that are causing problems for other people. Things like MRSA, and yeast and fungus. And it just kept killing them. It's like, well, that's cool. Let's see how gentle it is, because if it's going to give people 3rd-degree burns like it did to me, then we actually can't give it to people. And I don't want to use it on myself, frankly, which was what I was doing this for at the time. And it turned out it was super gentle. It wasn't even causing like allergies at all. So we've got this, nuclear bomb wrapped in a Care Bear is what I was feeling at the moment. Like this greasy, chapsticky Neosporin vibe thing that was killing every bug, that wasn't causing any problems. And I gave it to the doctors. We started using it on my wounds because doctors can use what they want. They have that liberty. And the wound started healing. It's like, okay, well, number one, that was a big turning point in my life, obviously, to start seeing progress in my own health. But number two was a huge wake-up call that maybe what they have, needs to get a second look. So I started doing some digging into the products that are currently in the physician's tool bag, specifically in my area at that time. And I found out some stuff that I swear even some of the most well-educated physicians today don't know about. Things like Neosporin has never been FDA approved, and that's what they were putting in that wound every time. It felt good, when they were pulling the packing out because it wasn't sticking to the wound, but it wasn't doing anything. This is a product that's patent is from 1951. It was grandfathered into an old system where anybody can make it. Anybody listening to this podcast right now can go get a Dun & Bradstreet number and address and make their own version of Neosporin as long as they're making it according to what's called good manufacturing processes and just start selling it legally. And that fascinates me. It disturbs me, but it fascinates me. It also fascinates me that there are other countries that recognize that things like antibiotics, because Neosporin is an antibiotic. We talk about antibiotic resistance. We're putting this stuff on every wound as first aid. It's not even infected yet. We're using it, like a hydrogen peroxide. So we wonder why it doesn't work anymore, because bacteria can beat things very quickly. So the system is antiquated. They had not updated what they call the monograph, the OTC monograph, over-the-counter monograph for antiseptics since 1994 at that time. Man, that made me mad. So at that point, I decided I wanted to take my product through the FDA, get the clearances, get the blessing, get it on the market, and start doing something about these antiquated products and, educate physicians and give this product to patients that actually did work and had been reviewed by the FDA. And I could say this is an FDA-cleared product. There's a series of steps that these products have to go through to get FDA clearance. And these steps are expensive, obviously, or they are thought to be expensive depending upon how they're done. It turns out over 90% of the costs typically go to consultants and lawyers and a lot of internal people. But if you actually read the documents and the draft guidances that the FDA puts out there, I had access to these vendors too, these labs, and I just started sending product out and running them through this process. I literally had nothing but a credit line that my mom actually signed for as a second signatory. And I got testing done that was the same stuff from the same labs that proved the same points, and the product was being made at a similarly regarded FDA facility, maybe even a better one, that I still work with to this day. And I got all the data showing that this product, had met the requirements for FDA clearance. So I went to literally Kinko's in Woodland Hills, California, and me sitting there with my vitamin water, building my binder, that I was putting together my FDA clearance documents, my indications for use forms, my summaries, my draft package inserts, my draft labels, my descriptions, my testing results. And I sent it off to the FDA and I paid the review fee, which is $7,000 at the time. And I ultimately got it cleared. And I did the entire thing for $24,000 because I didn't use any additional consultants. I didn't use any additional legal help. I used the FDA helpline. I called that phone all the time until they got, to the point where they knew me on a first name basis, and they were super friendly. And I think they were almost amused by the fact that there was this kid out there trying to get a product approved, without, one of these heavy duty consulting firms, doing it for them. And it actually got the blessing of the FDA. And for serious indication, things like, burns and trauma wounds and diabetic ulcers and donor sites and post-surgical incisions, like they cleared it for the real stuff. And I made 20,000 of those tubes. I got on a plane and I flew about 500,000 miles over a couple year period to hand out samples to people. And I just said, what do you have to lose? Here's the safety data. Try it. You're working with antiquated products. Give me the worst you got. And if it doesn't work, at least we tried. And that's when things got really unexpected and amazing for me and the company that it turned into. Doctors started publishing these miracle stories, these miracle results about, flesh-eating bacteria wounds where the person was going to get an amputation and it ended up, saving their leg, and, major, multi-month long ulcers and skin tears and studies like that, where the product was actually making real change, and doing it in significantly less time than these other antiquated products. And then I got a call from one of the biggest medical distributors on earth saying, hey, we want to carry this product because our biggest customer wants to replace their main wound care product with it. And then it was like, oh, well, I've got this kind of homemade website, a package that goes to my cell phone, and a one-man sales force that should probably actually, build a little bit more of an infrastructure here. And that's really when, even though, I had built a holding company to hold the intellectual property, that's really when Turn began. That was when I actually raised my first money. Granted, I had never raised money before, so I needed some help in terms of, introduction, because I literally had no idea what a venture capital firm was at that point. But there we were. So I didn't just find investors for this company. I self-funded a ton of it. And the way I actually self-funded it was I did other people's FDA clearances and FDA approvals. I think I've actually done 20 or 21 of them by now, because I realized that, number one, I could do it a lot cheaper, and it felt good to help entrepreneurs actually do things, and get products out there. But when you go through the FDA process that many times, on different categories, different products, everything from, personal lubricants to, electronic medical stimulation devices for muscles, I've seen a lot. And I've worked with a lot of reviewers, and I've worked in a lot of different categories. So I was also a regulatory consultant for a long time. So I definitely can speak to that area. The company just grew and grew. We now have 3 FDA clearances, 1,000 investors. We've got 2 drug programs right now. We've got a really amazing biodefense program that we're working on that's actually, hopefully going to help the troops. That's a meaningful project to me because I love working on behalf of our troops. Thank you for your service if you're listening. And we're now a credible threat. We're the real deal. And I've been through this from top to bottom. I guess I'd almost call it bottom to top, bottom in terms of where I was, in my life, to, where I feel like I am now, which is, I've battled through every stage of this process. And along the way, I met some of the most amazing innovators, some of the most amazing engineers, some of the most amazing scientists that have similar ideas, different areas, ways that they think that they could really help people, but haven't worn every hat like I have. I've worn the manufacturing hat. I have worn the design hat. I have worn the regulatory consultant hat. I've worn the sales rep hat. I've worn the investor pitch hat. I've worn the newsletter writing hat. And I've worn the CEO hat. I've worn the janitor hat. My first business card said CEO and janitor, because, frankly, nobody's better than another person in my company. We do what we got to do. And this show is about shining a light on people that don't necessarily know how to get through that process, and their innovations that could help so many people get stalled. And that makes me sad, because there are products and paradigms and, engineering feats that are out there that we don't have. And we've all heard shows about them, like I mentioned before. Amazing stem cell therapies, in places like Panama and Costa Rica. Now, they have cancer vaccines in other parts of the world. Our food system here, and how it's react after harm instead of approve then use, like in Europe, these need a real hard look as far as I'm concerned. So this show is going to shine a spotlight on the innovators, and it's going to shine a spotlight on the problems. It's going to shine a spotlight on why we don't have these things as part of our everyday medical system. It's going to shine a spotlight on all the different levels of red tape that people have to jump through, from raising money, from getting things manufactured, from the spending hundreds of millions of dollars on clinical trials to get things through so that you can have them. It's a complicated system. I mean, terms like investigational new drug trials, preclinical trials, CMC, DMF, I could have an entire conversation in acronyms. And that's why people feel like there's this barrier to entry. It's almost like you need an accountant to do your taxes, because you're scared that you're going to screw it up otherwise. And I actually went through that process, like doing my own taxes, but with the FDA. And, the FDA and I have a good relationship because I do everything by the book, but I had to learn the book. And I had to get the investors to believe in me and the doctors to believe in me and the system to believe in me enough that these products actually had a real chance at helping people. So we're going to talk to innovators. We're going to talk to scientists. We're going to talk to people that are doing amazing things here and in other parts of the world, nutritional experts, stem cell experts, cancer experts. We're also going to talk to policy people. We're going to talk about things like drug pricing. We're going to talk about things like how things in the supplement or the food industry or the drug industry or the device industry are regulated or unregulated in some cases, and ways that we could use modern technologies to actually better that and make our lives a little bit healthier. There's some policies out there that could be very quickly and easily changed using the tools that we have at our disposal now. And we're going to get into all that. And it's going to be a bit unfiltered, to be honest, because it has to be. We got to break through all this noise. I feel like we're at a really wonderful and pivotal point in history where even though people are mad, and I wish they'd stop throwing rocks at each other across the fence, it doesn't make you sound smarter when you yell louder. I just like the fact that we're talking about it. So this feels timely to me because we can educate people on both sides of the fence, frankly. It doesn't mean that my opinion or their opinion or your opinion or his or her opinion isn't right, but why don't we just inform them a little bit better? Instead of just saying my guy is smarter than your guy. I want to have those conversations. I want to get into the policy. I want to talk about why drug pricing here is so high. I want to talk about the good and the bad of socialized medicine. I want to talk about the good and the bad of privatized medicine. There are cures out there that we either don't know about, we can't afford, we have to get a plane ticket to get to, or those innovators can't tell us about them because they can't afford it. So there are walls, borders, red tape, and we're going to peel back those walls and we're going to cut that red tape, or we're going to talk to those innovators about why they're having so much trouble getting those products to you, those innovations to you. And we're going to look at it, not just how good the science is, but we're also going to look at it, why the system is excluding these products. This show is about what you deserve, what you don't have, and why you don't have it. Don't just listen. Please engage with us. Please talk to us. Please be a part of this. If you want to learn more about something, let us know. If you want to ask questions about something, let us know. And listen to us wherever you listen to your podcast. We're on all the major platforms. Watch us on YouTube. It's going to be a really amazing journey. So thank you for being here.